There we go. All right. Today I'm going to be talking about U.S. labor history in my live lecture on Twitch. I'm planning on doing these every Sunday at 3 p.m. I was doing that before, and then I had to take a break from TikTok for a little while, and from all my other, any online content that I was doing. Um, but like I said, I don't know how often I'll be looking here at these comments, and my actual slideshow, my PowerPoint for my lecture, will be up here on Twitch. Let me continue here getting my Twitch stream all set up. What was I? Oh, thank you, Claire. That is very, very kind of you. I really appreciate that. That's a very kind thing to say. Happy Easter. Thank you. Happy Easter to you, too. And let's see if anyone is going to show up on the Twitch side of things. Right now, I don't have any guests just yet. German Democratic Republic was active in correspondence chess until 1995. That's pretty interesting. I can't say I would have thought about correspondence chess going that long. And I guess to some degree, internet chess must have been what ultimately took over. I can't say I've spent too much time thinking about that particular thing. Um, all right. Still don't quite have anybody in Twitch here yet. I may give them a few more minutes. 3 o'clock is the normal scheduled time. 3 o'clock Central, that's where I'm at. No, I'm not from Connecticut. I am born and raised in Texas, and I'm still there. I'm not sure where you got Connecticut. I don't even think I've done any content related to Connecticut. I don't think so. I'd have to go back and double check that. Unless you meant CT Central Time, in which case that's correct. Uh, but have you done the world's deadliest food fight? No, I haven't. LMAO, wrong person. Howdy from Texas. Hello from California. Nice to have you here. Pretty soon, I'm going to be talking mostly to my Twitch viewers here. I may not look at these comments very often. So, you may want to hop over to Twitch if you want to get really involved in the experience. I've got a PowerPoint and everything. It's a good time. All right. I don't know why I'm typing to you, Jess. I could just say hello out loud. I am here. I don't know what I was thinking on that one. I'm very glad to have you here. Oh, I've got a handful of people here with me now. Very, very good. I'm glad. This is good. I believe I have resolved the internet issues I was having last time. In the office I'm in, I'm actually on like an extender, a Wi-Fi extender, and it was in like a weird place. It's a whole bunch of nonsense, but I don't think I'm going to drop out on you this time. Um, I am going to go ahead and start from the beginning of what I did last time. I went, I think, 15 or 20 minutes and did a fair portion of the presentation, but there's no reason to start in the middle. And who knows, maybe I'll tell it differently than I did that time. But better to start from the beginning again, to start fresh. And actually, I think I'm probably ready to go ahead and get started. Most of this is going to be in the late 19th, early 20th century that we're talking about today, for a couple of reasons. One of which is that's simply my specialty. That's the area I do most of my work. But it is also the area, the time period in which the majority of things related to labor history and the class consciousness and things like that happen, for a lot of reasons, one of which is the Industrial Revolution. And we'll talk about those kinds of things. But let's go ahead and get ourselves started here. So, we're talking about unions in particular, labor unions, and also socialism, and we'll talk about what that word actually means in the long 19th century. Now, if you don't read or do very much academic history, you may not know this term, long 19th century. It's a time period beginning in the late 1700s and extending to the early 1900s. And that's done this way because this is the time period in which industrialism and democratic movements and Enlightenment type ideals and all these things start to sweep the world. And it's a time period that you can sort of talk about extending beyond just the calendar years of the 1800s. And so we'll sort of see how some of these ideas all tie together. So, before we even get that far forward in time, though, labor organization in the United States begins much earlier than you might expect. Labor resistance, strikes, and work stoppages and those things, and early forms of organization are already beginning in the 17th century. In like the 1630s, the 1640s, you've got people who start to organize strikes and that kinds of things. And then by the 18th century, the early decades of the 18th century, guilds, as we would recognize them, are forming, and early unions, essentially, they called them combinations, are forming. So groups of tradesmen are starting to band together for their own interests at this time. Now, the biggest one that sort of kicks off the stuff that we're talking about is the Federal Society of Journeyman Cordwainers, if that's how it's pronounced. These guys are shoemakers. They're formed in 1794, this group of shoemakers in Philadelphia, but they will ultimately be disbanded in 1806 because they will be indicted by the court for conspiracy. Conspiracy is a term basically used in law, if I understand this correctly, to mean when groups of people get together to do things against the power structure, right? To put it very simply. It's not always the same way we use conspiracy now, especially colloquially. But there's a lot of these early legal challenges to labor organization. Again, 1806 Commonwealth v. Pullis is a Massachusetts, a Pennsylvania decision. And it sets this precedent and this tone for legal fights that you can take down unions with charges of conspiracy. What's interesting is that there's these mixed rulings, and unions themselves are usually not ruled illegal. They usually say unions or combinations have the right to exist, but they don't have the right to use these methods. What they're doing amounts to conspiracy, which kind of blows my mind. I don't understand how those thoughts are compatible. But there's a question over the legality of unions up until 1842, when the Massachusetts Supreme Court rules that labor unions are in fact legal. And even though that's not a full U.S. Supreme Court decision, that's the one that everyone sort of decides to abide by going forward, for the most part. So at this time, in the early 19th century, believe it or not, the idea of workers and the U.S. being a working class is already starting to form. And you have this idea of artisan republicanism. So the craftsmen in the urban areas in the United States have shared experiences, the way they do their work, the kind of work they do, both physically and intellectually, their position in society. And this leads to a degree of what we call class composition. This is where a group of people recognizes that they are a class of their own and should work together and can work together to better interests in that way. This is sort of what we might call socialism in some ways. And again, we'll get to defining the word itself a little later here. But keep that in mind. So ultimately, skilled workers, skilled craftsmen and artisans at this time believe that the United States should be a country that celebrates and values small-scale producers. They see people starting to work for wages, early things that we would recognize as factories, and they believe that people are being beholden, right, to their bosses, to the factories, and to this new system of life that's starting to develop. And so skilled craftsmanship, artisanal workmanship, yeoman farming even, these things are seen by a lot of Americans as the way to live up to the ideals of American independence that were set forth right in the Declaration and the Revolution and all these things, and that we should support that type of life rather than converting to, industrialism. And make no mistake, wage labor was seen as a form of slavery. Now, I'm not saying it was seen as equivalent to African American chattel slavery, although some used that language and used some of the same sort of analogies and that kinds of thing. But even though it wasn't seen as equivalent, it was seen very seriously as something that brought people down and did not allow them to live lives to their fullest, to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as it were. And so, because of this, you start to see political parties forming around this idea during this time. From 1827 to 1832, really small time frame, I know, but it's important. You see these trade societies, these groups of workers in urban centers, forming their own political parties. And they will protest corruption in politics, that businessmen have the pockets and these political systems in the cities. And they will also protest the imbalance of power in the workplace, in places where you're working for wages, or you're doing what they're calling the putting out system, which is where you make just part of something and it gets shipped off to be put together to make the whole. That's something they really do not enjoy. They will also advocate for standardized work days for the first time. Both the number of hours in the day is the most important, also a number of days in the week. But they want this because, with shorter days and longer days depending on the season, you might make more or less money, right? If pay is from sunup to sundown was often the system. So they want 10 hours rather than 8 like we have now. They try to advocate for 10-hour work days all year long. They will also advocate for free public schools, because again, this is seen as something that every citizen should have. They will advocate for reform of the compulsory militia service. If you watched my TikTok from not that long ago about gun regulation at this time, you may remember that militia service was still compulsory in a lot of places, even though at this point there was, of course, an actual regular army. But still, they don't like the way compulsory militia service is organized. They will want to abolish debtor's prison. They see no reason that people should be sent to prison for not being able to pay their debts, and a lot of other things that were relatively radical. But some of these ideas are really popular. So what will happen is they will be snuffed out and then co-opted by the established political order. The Democrat Party and the Whig Party at the time, WHIG, if you haven't seen that written out, they will take the most popular ideas like free public schools, and they will put those into their own platforms and sort of eliminate this third party of working men. Free public schools in particular becomes an extremely popular idea at this time. So they'll be snuffed out, but they will begin again in the 1870s, in the sort of bulk time period of unions and socialism as we would recognize it. And they'll start in California. I know there's actually a major working men's party in California in the 1870s, but in other places also. So this absolutely is the beginnings of something we would recognize as socialism. This document here, The Rights of Man to Property, was written by someone who was a member of one of these working men parties, a leader, I should say, of one of these working men's parties in New York. And Thomas Skidmore said, "It should be recollected that equal property being given to every human being as he arrives at the age of maturity would necessarily cause equal education, instruction, or knowledge, or nearly so. Men starting equal in property and knowledge could never have been cheated or forced into any such enormous injustice." So, referring to wage slavery, as they'd call it, and all of these, new systems of life. So this is a big deal. If it's not the first, it's one of the first documents anywhere that's espousing this sort of equality in this way, where everyone has access to the basic necessities of life, what he would argue are the basic necessities of life, and that will build a solid citizenry, right, where everyone will be to some degree equal. which again, the working men's parties and the Artisan Republicans would say is what America should be all about to begin with. Um, so, if we're going to talk about socialism and communism and these ideas, we have to talk about the Communist Manifesto, um, which is a big deal in all kinds of ways. You could obviously have a whole lecture just on this, but we're going to just make it a little part of what we're talking about today. So it's first published in 1848 by two German philosophers, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Friedrich Engels actually came from a family that owned factories, and he had worked not as a laborer, but management upper level in a factory, and seen the horrible conditions that people endured, and just the power imbalance, right? The power structure that exists in a factory. And these two philosophers put forth a new way of looking at history, essentially, is what the Communist Manifesto is about. It's a historical method. And Marx and Engels argue that working class revolution is inevitable in a capitalist system, right? That eventually the workers will realize they have power, that they will band together and use that power to seize the means of production which they rightfully should own. And they own both the physical, things that they produce. They own the intellectual ideas that they use to produce things. This is the idea, right? That the people who manage the capitalist system are essentially leeching off of the people who are working, is one of the many ideas. Again, you could go deep into this, but we'll keep it basic. Now, at the time, because of this document being relatively radical in a couple of ways, it is largely suppressed in Germany and elsewhere. And it will fall into obscurity at first, in particular following the failures of the revolutions of 1848. So in 1848, revolution sweeps several European countries, working class, lower level revolutions, but they will be put down. And so between the failure of the revolutions of 1848 and the suppression of the publication of the book, these ideas kind of go away, especially in Europe, for a little while. But then the book will first be published in the U.S. in 1871. Hello, Out of Her Mind. Glad to have you here. It will be first published in the U.S. in 1871, and it will also begin to gain traction internationally at that time. And again, this is because the Industrial Revolution, as we would recognize it, is really ramping up. So then the Communist Manifesto will become internationally well known, and these ideas will become internationally well known during and following the Russian Revolution, right, in which this becomes to some degree an example of what Marx and Engels were talking about, right, in which a socialist revolution deposes the existing system. Now, the Russian Revolution had a lot more going on, and the degree to which it was successful and actually reflects Marx and Engels, that's a whole nother lecture. But that's certainly part of what it was seen as at the time. So, at this point, we really need to sit down for a second and talk about what is communism and what is socialism. What do these words mean? In practical terms, how do these systems operate? Well, first of all, they're both economic systems. A lot of people refer to these and use them as if they were government systems, like democracy or republicanism or monarchy or any of those things, but it's separate, sort of. They mesh together, but it's important to recognize that it's economic as much as anything. And they're systems both in which producers publicly own and control the means of production. The people making the stuff own the ways to make the stuff. And they also control the distribution of the products and the profits. So again, when people make stuff, it doesn't go to managers who told them how to make stuff. It goes to them. Now, there are some big differences in the way the two operate. Socialism is mostly democratic. It's mostly people working together and voting together and creating systems in which they all benefit together, and uses democratic means to achieve this revolution, for lack of a better term. Whereas communism is mostly authoritarian. You're not having a lot of voting in communism generally, and the state has a much stronger arm in communism, right? And the state has much greater control over the economic system, if not complete and total control. So that brings us to private property, right? Private property still exists under socialism in most cases. In the theory, I mean, when we put these things into practice, it becomes a whole nother ballgame. But under communism, there is very little, if any, private property, especially when we're talking about land or, you know, real estate or big things like that. In both systems, you still have, you know, clothes and personal goods and things like that, for the most part. Communism is generally achieved through violent revolution, if not violent, something approaching violent. And again, socialism is generally achieved through democratic political methods and using the existing, you know, governmental system to achieve this economic revolution. Now, Marx and Engels believed that socialism was a stepping stone. They believed it was a required stepping stone to get to communism, and that this process would be inevitable, that socialism would always eventually lead to communism. Now, this hasn't happened in most places for all kinds of reasons, and that's something that I have done sort of some work on. Well, not original work, but I mean my research, my own reading, my learning. But why that hasn't happened is not an easy question to answer. But Marx and Engels believed that it would. So, let's talk then about how unions begin to arise, how some of these processes that Marx and Engels predicted do begin to happen. And one of the ways this happens is through international cooperation of working class people. Again, they start to realize that the borders among them are not as relevant as their shared experiences. And so the first international trade union, which only US and Canada when it begins, is the International Typographical Union, formed in 1852. Typers, typesetters, printers, these people will band together. It's a little while before we get other really big, major international unions. We have a few during the late 19th century, but the Teamsters, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, is founded in 1903, and that's one of the most influential unions still today. Now, Teamsters, you know, at the time meant horse drivers, right? People who drove teams of horses. Today, it's all kinds of laborers, and it's a lot more than just horse drivers. And that changed for all kinds of reasons. The industrial workers of the world, who we're going to talk more about later, also known as the Wobblies, they're formed in 1905, and they have the idea of one big union. At the time, you see these trade unions, right? The typists, the Teamsters, all these people are separate. The Wobblies don't want it to be that way. They want one big union where all of the working class is doing these things together. And we're going to talk more about them on another slide. Now, it's important to know that even the unions that are not international by their organization are still international in practice. The demographic makeup of the working class and of unions is extremely international, transnational, whatever word you want to use, multi-ethnic, right? The workforce of the United States, beginning in the late 19th century, has people from all over Europe and all over the world, and the same thing in South America and in Europe. You have people really on the move doing industrial work. Most people in the world are actually not staying put in a place for very long, or most working class industrial workers in particular. So, another big union that we need to talk about, or labor organization, is the Knights of Labor, who you probably have heard of. Founded in 1869, the Knights of Labor are the first big union that have national reach and influence. Up to this point, basically every one of these unions that we've talked about, really even the international ones, have mostly localized influence. And again, like the shoemakers that we talked about earlier, had localized influence in Philadelphia and New York and Boston and these kinds of places. But they weren't able to connect as well as they needed to. The Knights of Labor are ultimately able to change that. And part of that has to do with technology, right? The railroad and the telegram, and all kinds of communication and transportation that changes and allows people to connect more. Heck, the mail even goes faster, and you can send out your publications and things like that. And so the other thing that's important about them is they will accept workers of all skill levels, both men and women. And both of those things are really, really radical. So in these, again, this artisan Republican mindset, you had people, who were skilled workers, considered themselves skilled workers who were not interested in the wage workers, right? They saw themselves as a separate class. And certainly men were not allowing women into their unions. This was not happening. So the Knights of Labor is able to increase their influence by allowing more people into their group. But unfortunately, their influence will wane within a couple of decades due to their sort of secrecy and ritual. Think of like the Freemasons and other, secret societies like this. They're also having internal factualism, how to operate, what kind of methods to use, should they have these secrets and rituals or not. And there's also growing influence of other big unions, in particular the American Federation of Labor. And there will also be a series of labor defeats in their battles that ultimately will lead the Knights of Labor to cease to exist. One of these defeats, this isn't one of the defeats. This is one of the few successes of the Knights of Labor. And this is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. And this one is pretty big victory. It will begin in Martinsburg, West Virginia. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad will cut pay for the third time in a year. And this is in the middle of an economic depression, or a recession anyway, on top of that. And so the strike will begin, they will insist that the B&O reverse that third pay cut. They don't even insist anything else at that particular moment. Just a reversal of that pay cut, which seems a reasonable enough. Sorry, I had a message I had to approve or deny there in the chat. So this strike will spread when the B&O Railroad refuses to meet the strikers' demands. It will spread to 5 other states out of West Virginia, and it will involve 100,000 workers at its height. The country had never seen a strike like this. Most of the world had never seen a strike on this scale. It was really astounding. On top of that, most law enforcement is sympathizing. They refuse to attack the strikers or to take them down. So ultimately, the B&O Railroad and other companies will have the federal government call in their troops. And President at the time, Rutherford B. Hayes, does not hold back. He sends in the National Guard, he sends in the Army, and ultimately will defeat the strike. But that doesn't mean it was a total defeat. The strike lasted 69 days, which is astounding. And there is some victory for the federal government in this. They will construct new National Guard armories, and they will organize new National Guard units. And these armories and units still exist today that were formed because of this. To further their purpose for decades, of course, was to hold off strikes more than anything else. But this will be seen in the public by many as a victory for labor, in that they see that something needs to be done for the working classes. And the support of the Knights of Labor will grow, especially with Catholic support, support from the Catholic Church, who had previously not allowed the joining of unions. But they will change with this strike. And of course, many American laborers are Catholic. They come from European countries that are predominantly Catholic at the time. So, now we can talk about the American Federation of Labor that ultimately will replace the Knights of Labor. They will be formed in 1886 with offshoots, disaffected members of the Knights of Labor. And especially they're fighting that internal factionalism over funding structures. The Knights of Labor wanted all of the money from the local chapters to be sent straight up to the top, basically, and to have everything done top down. and a lot of the members didn't agree with doing it that way. They wanted more local chapters to be able to use more of that money locally. Now, that being said, this is not like the Knights of Labor because it's made up mostly of men, mostly of white men, and mostly of skilled workers. And they're also not doing much political organization, especially like some of those earlier groups had done. They're doing what's called business unionism, which is working with the businesses directly and sort of trying to operate within the economic and business structures rather than trying to operate within the state and the political structure to make changes. They will be severely damaged by what was called the open shop movement in the 1900s and the 1920s, which was essentially where you were not required to join a union, or you were encouraged not to join a union. All these kinds of things, businesses that just kept the unions shut out, basically. Then in the 1930s, they will have more splits over industrial unionism versus trade unionism. So the difference between the two, again, in trade and craft unionism, it's a specific thing that you do. So if you work on the railroad as somebody who loads the train cars, you might be in a different union than the engineer or, other people who work in the railroad industry. Industrial unionism is where everybody within a certain industry is in the same union. So no matter what you do on the railroad, you would be in the railroad union. Or if you were a miner, or whatever kind of job you did in the mine, you would still be in the mining union. And they can't agree over which of these things is better in the AFL. And this will lead to a split that creates another new union, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which will do that, again, that industrial unionism. And ultimately, they will resolve these differences within a couple of decades. And then when they rejoin in 1955, they become the AFL-CIO, which I just think is kind of funny that they still retained those two separate identities when rejoining. So, let's talk about some more of these sort of famous labor events. Maybe you've heard of these, maybe you know them from school or not, or from, other things, History Channel or something like that. One of the really big ones that's a blow to the labor movement is the Haymarket Affair. You may have also heard this called the Haymarket Riot or the Haymarket Massacre, depending on which side is telling the story. Haymarket Affair is the best because it's right there in the middle, in my opinion. So there are May Day, May 1st striking and rallies that are happening. I've forgotten what year this is off the top of my head. You know what? I'm actually going to Google that because I didn't put it in my PowerPoint like I should have, and I've forgotten the year. 1886. Okay, so May 1st, 1886. There are strikes and rallies that are in Chicago at first, and they will spread nationally very quickly. This is perhaps as many as 500,000 workers involved in these strikes that are over, again, the standardized work day. They're over terrible conditions. They're over the imbalance of power in the workplace, pay cuts, things like that. And these protests and rallies, these strikes, stay mostly peaceful. But on May 3rd, the Chicago police will fire into a crowd that they believe is getting too rowdy. They will kill at least one person and wound several more. But even then, these rallies stay mostly peaceful, even after that, until on May 4th in Chicago, what was started as a peaceful rally is disrupted by the police again. Not firing at first this time, but they're just trying to break it up. And an unknown assailant, somebody that we still don't know who was responsible today, will attack the police with a dynamite bomb. They'll throw a bomb directly at the police in the crowd. And total chaos ensues at this point, because no one even knows who has... I think at the time, no one even really knew who had done it. And in this chaos, 7 police officers will be killed, 4 civilians will be killed, and many dozens, I believe, are injured. Several more people are injured on top of the people killed. Of course, now at this point, the police and the government are out for blood, perhaps reasonably so. 8 men will be convicted for this affair, this riot, this massacre. 4 will be hanged. despite a very biased jury and a total lack of evidence against the men that were convicted. They basically just picked some guys that they didn't like. And even at the time, this is not just historical analysis. People at the time were saying how unjust this trial was. The labor movement will be permanently damaged by the Haymarket Affair. It will be linked to malignant foreign influence, right? These, again, workers that are from all over the world are seen as people who are bringing in socialism or communism or violence or anything from other places, which isn't really true for all kinds of reasons. And it will also be linked to violent radicalism, right? The many people in America and around the world see the labor movement as something that will only achieve what it wants through violent means. And that's, of course, in part because of the influence of the Communist Manifesto, which does say that that is inevitable. So, we have another really famous, important event here that we need to talk about, and that's the Pullman Strike. This happens in 1894. George Pullman was a railroad magnate who made cars, railroad cars. And in particular, sleeper cars, but also other train cars. Pullman will lay off hundreds of workers and cut wages in 1893, and again, this is during a recession. It always seems to be during a recession that these things happen. And on top of laying off people and cut wages, he will refuse to reduce the rent or the prices on goods in the company town where many of his workers lived. You weren't actually required to live there, but your treatment was even worse if you didn't live there than if you did. So obviously this enrages the workers of the Pullman Company, even the ones who don't live in the company town. And a man named Eugene V. Debs, who is the leader of the American Railway Union, will call for a nationwide boycott of Pullman cars, which, you know, they're on every railroad, basically. They're a ubiquitous train car. And so this boycott will, in fact, be nationwide. It will be a huge boycott and rallies and protests and these kinds of things. And again, they stay peaceful at first, but a federal injunction will be served after property is destroyed at one of these rallies in 1894. And this injunction against Eugene V. Debs in particular, but also the ARU, will be enforced by federal troops. Again, President Cleveland does not hesitate to send in federal troops to enforce this. But what's funny is, right before he sends the troops in, President Cleveland will sign a bill making Labor Day a federal holiday. And he does this to get some political support, right? He doesn't like the optics of totally destroying this strike and this boycott with the army. So he decides to try to balance it out. And at this point, things become violent, and the strikes will become extremely violent before being suppressed. In Chicago, they will destroy a number of rail cars. The National Guard will fire into a mob and kill people. But again, ultimately, the federal troops are able to put down this nationwide strike again. But one of the things that comes out of this is that Eugene V. Debs will become an extremely prominent national figure. He's someone you might have heard of in history classes or, again, on programs or other places like that. But we don't really talk about him as much as we probably should. He was an extremely important political figure. And we will return to him. But I want to talk about another group here. And actually, I want to take a drink of water real quick. Okay. So, I also then want to talk about the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, who are significant for a number of reasons, one of which is that it's a powerful women's union, which was comparatively unusual. They will be founded in 1900 in New York City, mostly by shirtwaist factory workers. If you've heard of that Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, in which young women and girls, mostly Jewish immigrant girls, are killed because they are locked into a building that is on fire. These are the types of workers that had founded this union prior to that. They will start organizing strikes, and these strikes will spread and be pretty successful. Um, there's what's called the Uprising of 20,000 in 1909, and then the Great Revolt, which had 60,000 workers in 1910. Now, these are much smaller numbers than those nationwide strikes like were happening with the Great Railroad Strike and the Haymarket Affair and the Pullman Strike. But they're still getting recognition. They're getting a lot done, getting those ideas out there, and getting some concessions from businesses occasionally. And then again, after that Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911, their power and their membership will increase, because even people who did not see the labor movement favorably were really horrified by that Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. There were, photographs in the newspaper of the broken bodies of young girls on the street who had jumped out of the window in an attempt not to burn to death, right? And the doors of the factory had been locked so that these girls couldn't take unauthorized breaks or couldn't easily steal things from the factory. And that was not seen as reasonable by most of the American public. And the safety measures in things like that, you weren't allowed to lock the doors in that way anymore after that. Lots of things about safety measures did change, in part because of the work of the ILGWU. They also got a lot of assistance, which was not always welcome, from wealthy women who were referred to sort of derogatively as the Mink Brigade, right? Wealthy women did want to be involved and to help, but many working class women did not welcome that help because they believed that the wealthy women didn't have those same experiences and didn't belong. They were not part of the same class. And just like we've seen with all these other big unions that we've talked about so far, they will decline in their power. These ladies in the 1920s, due to internal factionalism, they will disagree over what methods to use, what things they should be fighting for, and that ultimately will lead to the decline in their influence. We also want to talk about the Wobblies. I told you we would return to them because they're still around today and they are a really important group. I don't know why they're called the Wobblies, and there's a lot of debate over how they became called the Wobblies. In case you were going to ask, I'm not 100% sure. But again, they're formed in 1905, and they're promoting the idea of one big union. They will also welcome everyone, and when I say everyone, I mean all skill levels, men and women, and people of color. And this is, people of color in particular, is different than essentially any other group that had come before. Even, the Knights of Labor that welcomed all skill levels in men and women did not welcome African Americans or other people of color into their group. The AFL supported the Chinese Exclusion Act, those kinds of things. But the IWW welcomes everyone. They will believe more in direct action to get their ideas, and their ideas is not the word I'm looking for, but to get their demands met. And they especially will promote sabotage of industrial equipment and processes. And that's something that goes back many decades that's part of this larger movement. But the IWW really believes that that is useful. Rather than being subservient to the political and capitalist systems, right? They saw attempts to work within the system as fruitless, that they would only lead to concessions that ultimately would not get them anywhere. And their primary goal was, and probably still is, if you ask them, to abolish wage labor entirely. The wage system is not the way they see the world needs to operate. So in some ways, you can see sort of ties back to those ideas of artisan republicanism, although it's not direct. But again, just like with everything, they will have a schism. They will have internal factionalism over socialism versus syndicalism, which is sort of difficult to explain. But basically, it's a type of this communist revolution and a type of organization of multiple unions working together to achieve these goals. And a schism over anti-war activism, whether or not they should be, in fact, anti-war, although the group mostly is anti-war. And this does not work for the American public, to be sure. And so this will lead to their decline in influence in the 1920s. Don't know if you're seeing a pattern here on that one or not. But that doesn't mean that these ideas are going away entirely. Quite the contrary. A lot of ideas about socialism, as we're defining it here in particular, are making it within to the mainstream of America. They're becoming, pretty recognized, and people are at least willing to debate it if they don't accept it, and willing to discuss some of the ideas that these people are promoting. Um, there are multiple socialist parties formed throughout American history. The one that Eugene V. Debs was a leader in was formed in 1901, and it will last until the 1970s. But again, there are some that were formed before. In fact, one formed before that still exists today. This is just one socialist party that was influential. After the Pullman Strike, and after spending 6 months in prison for his actions in the Pullman Strike, Debs will become a prominent figure within the socialist parties and within socialist politics. And he will run for president on the socialist ticket in 1900, 1904, 1908, and 1912. And in 1912, he does particularly well. He will receive nearly 1 million votes, which is about 6% of the electorate, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's pretty significant. And more importantly than that is his visibility and his influence, and the influence of the Socialist Party leads to a huge socialist movement sweeping the government and the state houses. The party will get a number of federal officials elected, and a number of local officials, mayors, state legislators, dozens upon dozens of socialist leaders, and even 2 U.S. representatives will be socialists during this time period. So there's really significant influence. He will also help to co-found the Wobblies. He will be part of that anti-syndicalist. I need to refresh myself on the syndicalism, if I'm being honest about it. But he will be part of that schism, and he will oppose those actions. He will be arrested again in 1918 for violating the Sedition Act. They say he was giving an anti-war speech. That speech only even mentioned the war once, but they wanted a reason to arrest him. He will be sentenced then to 10 years in federal prison. He will run again in 1920, campaigning from his prison cell, and will receive 1 million votes. Again, I think over 1 million that time, actually. So even in prison, his influence does not wane. His sentence will eventually be commuted. He doesn't get a pardon, but he does get a commutation. He does not spend that full 10 years in prison, if I remember correctly. But ultimately, after that period, and because of the decline of these organizations, organized labor and the socialist movement and these kinds of things will decline in the U.S. and some other places. Although, the labor parties still exist in the UK and in many other countries. Organized labor parties are still an important part of the political landscape, basically everywhere but the United States, or every democratic, liberal with a lowercase l country, and democratic with a lowercase d. They mostly have labor parties, and the United States does not. By the end of World War I, organized labor is largely defeated, and it will never fully recover. They make some gains during the New Deal era, the late 20s, the early 30s, through the New Deal processes, and even during World War II, in part because of the visibility of the working class in factories in World War II. But they will be lost again even before the 1950s happen, because of, Red Scares, communism, all of these things. And unionism has been on a steady decline in the U.S. since then. I think we may be now at our lowest point of union members. I'd have to look that up again to be sure. They, of course, experienced violent defeats at the hands of the federal troops, the National Guard, the Pinkerton Detective Agency, who you may have heard of. Organized labor is violently put down again and again and again and again and again. And of course, in American society, labor is linked to foreign subversion and violent revolution and just being generally anti-American, whatever that might mean. And again, you've probably heard this term, the Red Scare. There are two big ones of those. One in the 19 teens because of the Russian Revolution, another in the 1940s and 50s, the Cold War era, and Russia rising to power. And to some degree, we're seeing Red Scares. We saw one, a mini one in the 80s and even now. But the big ones, if you're reading like a history textbook, will be around the end of World War I and around the end of World War II. And so that's where we are now at this point with organized labor and with socialist movements and labor movements. And so that is the end of the lecture. That one went a little longer than some of them have in the past, but I hope you've enjoyed that, and I'm happy to take any questions you have, any comments, any feelings, thoughts, anything like that. Criticisms, if they are constructive and fact-based, obviously, I always insist on those things. This can be a touchy topic, I know, for many people. But I am happy to take any questions if you have them. And if not, that's okay too. I am glad the handful of you have been here to listen and to pay attention. And it's nice. It's nice to get back in the saddle again and be doing lectures like this again. But I will give just another moment or two. Let me double check the TikTok chat here and see if I had anything related to I don't see any questions there. This was all really interesting. Some of this is a lecture book I'm reading by Angela Davis. I'd have to double check that name. I don't know if I know that one. Very well done. Thank you. I appreciate that, guys. For those of you who are here too, I'm speaking directly to the TikTok live now rather than the Twitch. Is one of the reasons socialism rarely leads to communism, intervention from capitalist countries. That's absolutely a huge reason. I'm kind of trying to look at you and look at the Twitch camera here. Yes, that's absolutely a huge reason. And, the setting up of puppet governments in other countries and intervening in those things is one of the reasons, although there's a lot more to it than that, right? But every country has different reasons of why these things don't take off to the same degree. Do you equate the same sentiments of the past Red Scares to the fear that many in the USA have of China? There's some equivalence you can draw. There's some things there you can put together. The degree to which it's the same is debatable. It's a great question, and I don't know that I have a clear answer on that. Part of course, with China is racism and xenophobia play a huge role in China, less so than it does in the fear of Russia and the former Soviet bloc and those things. So that's an important part to keep in mind. Very good. All right, everybody. I'm going to, I think, sign off now and say goodbye. Thank you so much for being here. I really have appreciated having you here. I will be doing this, hopefully, every single Sunday at 3 p.m. Central Time. That is my plan, to start doing it again every Sunday unless something else absolutely keeps me away. I haven't decided on next week's topic yet, but a lot of them will be more novel, like I've talked about the history of the circus in past ones. Sometimes we'll do serious topics like this, and sometimes we'll do maybe more fun-ish ones. Would you say that the USSR and 20th century China were truly communist or not? There's no such thing as truly communist, truly socialist, truly capitalist, and anything. Everything is always hybridized. That's the basic answer to that question. Everyone wants to see things as being truly this or truly that, but that will never exist no matter what Marx and Engels say, is my opinion. So, I, with that, am going to sign off, and I will see you all next time.